She spent 3 years married to a man who never touched her, never asked who she was, and never looked back when she walked away. The night he finally said, "I love you," was the moment she discovered the marriage had never been real. 3 years. That was how long she had shared a house, a last name, and a marriage bed that was never touched. 3 years married to a powerful man who treated her like furniture, useful for appearances, invisible in private. And the night he finally looked at her like a woman, not an obligation, was the night she realized everything she believed about her marriage was a lie. Welcome to Untold Journey Stories. Before we begin, ask yourself this quietly because it will matter later. If the person who ignored you for years suddenly wanted you back, would you believe them, or would it already be too late? This story begins long before love. It begins with silence. Claire Lawson had been married to Julian Cross for exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days. She knew the number because time moved differently when you were being ignored. Each day stretched heavy and colorless, as if the walls themselves were absorbing her presence and erasing it. Julian Cross was everything the world admired: a celebrated CEO, controlled, brilliant, untouchable, the kind of man magazines described as disciplined and visionary, the kind of man investors trusted with billions. At home, he barely noticed his wife. In 3 years, they had shared fewer than 50 real conversations. Not arguments, not laughter, conversations. He spoke to her the way he spoke to assistants, with efficiency, distance, and no curiosity. Their marriage was quiet, painfully polite, and completely empty. Claire learned his schedule the way prisoners learn routines. Breakfast at 6:15, meetings until late, a closed office door every night. She woke early so she could eat and disappear before he came downstairs. It was easier than being seen and dismissed. That morning felt no different. Claire stood in the kitchen at 6, coffee cooling in her hands, waiting for the familiar sound of footsteps that meant she should leave. Except this time, the footsteps came early. Julian was already descending the stairs. She froze. Claire? Her name hit the air like a disruption. He hadn't said it in months. She turned slowly, heart pounding, and found him standing there in a tailored suit, composed as ever, blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that didn't belong to routine. "Yes," she asked, careful not to show surprise. "I need you at a corporate event tomorrow night," he said. Flat, professional, 7 o'clock. She stared at him. "You've never taken me to one. I need to appear stable," he replied. "Married. You're my wife. On paper." The words sliced deeper than he realized. Something inside her snapped, quiet but final. "You don't even know who I am," Claire said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "What I studied, what I do, what I think about while you ignore me." Julian hesitated. For the first time, he didn't have an immediate answer. She stepped past him then, head high, dignity intact, leaving behind a man who was just beginning to realize that the woman he had dismissed for years was not invisible at all. That night would change everything. Not because it was romantic, not because it was tender, but because it would introduce another man into the story. A man who would see Claire immediately. A man who would listen. A man who would awaken something dangerous inside Julian Cross. Jealousy. And jealousy, when it arrives late, doesn't ask permission. It takes. If this story already has you questioning loyalty, love, and second chances, take a moment to support the channel by subscribing to Untold Journey Stories. Your support helps us bring you more powerful stories about love, loss, and the moments that change everything. Because what happens next will test every boundary this marriage was built on. And before we continue, here's a question for you. If you were Claire, which would you choose? A. Stay with the husband who ignored you for years but suddenly claims he's changed. B. Walk away and choose the person who saw your worth from the beginning. Comment A or B below. That quiet moment in the kitchen was supposed to fade like all the others, but instead it followed Claire for the rest of the day, settling into her thoughts and refusing to leave. The next evening arrived faster than she expected. Claire stood alone in the bedroom she had occupied since the wedding, smoothing the fabric of a navy dress she hadn't worn in years. She had bought it before the marriage, back when she still believed she would be invited into Julian's world. Not hidden from it. The dress was simple, restrained, almost modest, yet it felt like armor. If she was going to be seen, she would be seen on her own terms. At exactly 7, she descended the stairs. Julian was waiting in the living room, immaculate in a black suit, posture flawless, expression unreadable. When he looked up and saw her, something almost imperceptible passed through his eyes. Surprise, hesitation, interest. It vanished just as quickly. "You look appropriate," he said. Appropriate. Not beautiful. Not stunning. But his gaze lingered longer than his words admitted, and Claire noticed. The drive to the hotel was silent. She watched the city pass by, lights blurring against the window, heart racing with a mix of nerves and resentment. For 3 years she had lived in this city as Julian Cross's wife, yet tonight would be the first time the world saw her standing beside him. The ballroom was already alive when they arrived. Laughter, crystal glasses, the low hum of power and money moving effortlessly through the room. Claire felt like an imposter, but she held herself with the grace she had learned from observation and survival. Julian introduced her with practiced efficiency. "My wife, Claire." The word landed differently here. Public. Weighted. Real. It was during their first conversation that everything shifted. Daniel Reed approached with an easy confidence, the kind that didn't need to dominate a room to be felt. He greeted Julian politely, then turned to Claire with genuine curiosity, not obligation. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you," he said. "Your husband keeps his personal life very private." Claire smiled. "I've noticed." Daniel laughed softly, and for the first time that night, Claire felt herself relax. The conversation flowed naturally. He asked her questions Julian never had: where she studied, what she worked on before the marriage, what interested her beyond the role she was expected to play. When she answered, honestly and without shrinking, Daniel listened. Julian watched from the side, something tightening in his chest. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her voice to sound so confident, her presence so effortless, or another man to look at her like she mattered. When Daniel learned about her background in international consulting, his interest sharpened. He spoke about projects, about opportunities overseas, about how rare it was to find someone with her insight and discipline. Julian interrupted sharply. "Claire doesn't work." The words echoed louder than he intended. Daniel raised an eyebrow, then smiled politely. "That's a shame. Talent like hers shouldn't sit unused." Claire felt something warm and dangerous rise inside her. Validation. After years of being unseen, it was intoxicating. "I'd be interested," she said, meeting Daniel's eyes. "Very interested." Julian's jaw tightened. The rest of the evening passed in fragments. Conversations blurred. Laughter sounded distant. Claire noticed that Julian never left her side again, positioning himself between her and Daniel with quiet possessiveness. It confused her. It angered her. It thrilled her in ways she didn't want to admit. On the ride home, the tension was suffocating. "You're not having dinner with him," Julian said abruptly. She turned toward him slowly. "And why not?" "Because I said so." She laughed, humorless. "You don't get to decide who I see. You made that clear for 3 years. You're my wife." "Only when it's convenient," she replied. "Only when someone else notices me." He had no answer. At home, she went straight upstairs, but his voice stopped her at the doorway. "Claire?" She turned. "Tonight," he said quietly, "you surprised me." She studied him, searching for sincerity. "I shouldn't have." She closed the door behind her, heart racing. Across the hall, Julian didn't sleep. He paced. The image of Daniel leaning toward her, listening, smiling, stayed burned into his mind. It wasn't just jealousy that unsettled him. It was the realization that another man had seen in one evening what he had ignored for 3 years. The next morning, he woke earlier than usual and went downstairs. Claire was already there, sitting at the counter, wrapped in a simple robe, hair loose, face bare. Morning light traced the curve of her profile. For the first time, Julian truly saw her, not as a role, not as an obligation, but as a woman he might lose. "You're staring," she said calmly, without looking at him. He cleared his throat. "Are you canceling dinner tonight?" She turned then, eyes steady. "No." "Why not?" "Because attention feels different when it's earned," she replied, "and respect feels different when it's given freely." Her words hit harder than any accusation. Julian stepped closer, unsure, unpracticed. "You matter." She searched his face. "Do I? Or are you just afraid someone else thinks I do?" The silence between them grew heavy. Something had shifted, not resolved, not healed, but awakened. and neither of them knew yet how dangerous that awakening would be. The tension that lingered between them that morning did not fade. It settled, like a quiet storm waiting for the right moment to break. Claire kept her word. That evening she went to dinner with Daniel. She chose an emerald green dress, one she had kept hidden in the back of her closet, untouched for years, waiting for a moment that might never come. Wearing it felt like reclaiming a part of herself she had buried when she became Julian Cross's wife. When she walked down the stairs, keys in hand, she didn't see Julian anywhere. For a second, she wondered if he had already retreated into indifference. Then she heard his voice behind her. "You're going out." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she replied calmly, turning to face him. "I told you I would." He stood near the doorway, jacket still on, tie loosened, as if he had been pacing. When his eyes landed on her, he stopped short. The color suited her too well. Not in a decorative way, but in a way that announced confidence, intention, and independence. "You look." He hesitated, clearly searching for a neutral word. "Different." She smiled faintly. That's what happens when someone finally feels seen. The words stung, and they were meant to. Daniel picked her up exactly on time. He opened the door for her, spoke to her with warmth, and asked how her day had been, as if the answer mattered. It shouldn't have felt extraordinary, but to Claire, it did. The restaurant was elegant but understated, filled with low music and soft light. They talked easily, not just about work, but about choices, about the strange paths people end up on when life stops being theirs. Daniel never once mentioned Julian unless Claire brought him up, and when she did, he listened without judgment. "You deserve more than silence," he said gently at one point. "No one should feel invisible in their own life." Across the city, Julian sat alone in his office, staring at a screen he hadn't touched in an hour. Every scenario played in his mind without permission. Daniel laughing, Daniel leaning closer, Daniel touching her hand. The realization terrified him. He had built his life on control of markets, of outcomes, of people. But this was different. This was raw and unfamiliar and completely out of his hands. By the time Claire returned home, it was nearly 11. Julian was waiting. He stood in the hallway, hands in his pockets, posture rigid, as if holding himself together required effort. "You're late," he said. "I wasn't watching the clock," she replied. His eyes darkened. "Did you enjoy yourself?" "Yes," she answered honestly. "I did." Something dangerous flickered across his face. "What exactly did you enjoy?" She studied him carefully. "Being listened to, being treated like a person." He stepped closer. "You are my wife." "For 3 years that didn't matter," she said quietly. "Why does it matter now?" "I don't know," he admitted, the words coming out sharper than he intended. "But it does." The admission hung between them, heavy and unresolved. The following days blurred into something neither of them recognized. Julian started coming home early, canceling meetings, asking questions he should have asked years ago. Claire noticed the effort, but she didn't soften. Effort didn't erase absence. Daniel, meanwhile, extended a formal offer. A consulting role on an international project. Real responsibility, real autonomy. When Claire accepted the invitation to discuss details over lunch, she didn't hide it. Julian found out anyway. He followed them. He told himself it was coincidence, curiosity. But when he saw Daniel place a hand lightly on Claire's wrist as he spoke, something inside Julian snapped. He walked straight to their table. The confrontation was swift and public. Julian's voice stayed controlled, but his words carried weight. Ownership, claim, authority he had never exercised when it truly mattered. Claire stood up, mortified and furious. "You don't get to do this," she said through clenched teeth. "Not here, not now, not ever." The silence that followed was suffocating. In the parking lot, away from curious eyes, the truth finally erupted. "You don't get to act like you own me," Claire said. "You forfeited that right when you chose indifference." Julian ran a hand through his hair, frustration bleeding through his composure. "I don't know how to do this," he confessed. "I don't know how to be what you need." "Then stop trying to control it," she replied, "and start trying to understand it." That night, Claire barely slept. Neither did Julian. Something fundamental had shifted, but it wasn't resolution. It was exposure. Raw emotions dragged into the light without instruction or safety. And beneath all of it, hidden where neither of them wanted to look yet, was a truth waiting to be discovered. One that would explain everything. and threatened to destroy what little they had just begun to build. What neither of them understood yet was that jealousy was only the surface tremor, because something far more devastating was already buried beneath their marriage, waiting to be uncovered. The days after the confrontation did not bring peace. They brought proximity. Julian began coming home earlier, not with announcements or apologies, but with presence. He sat at the dining table instead of eating alone. He lingered in shared spaces as if relearning the geography of his own house. He asked questions, not sharp ones meant to extract information, but hesitant ones, as though he were unsure he was allowed to ask at all. How was your meeting? Did you enjoy the project discussion? What are you reading? Each question landed awkwardly, like a foreign language spoken too late in life. Claire answered him with restraint. She did not reject him, but she did not reward him either. She had learned, painfully, that affection given too quickly could be taken just as easily. Daniel remained a steady presence, never demanding more than she offered. His interest did not push, it simply existed. That, more than anything, unsettled Julian. One evening, Claire found Julian waiting in the living room, the lights low, his jacket draped over a chair instead of hanging neatly where it belonged. "I heard you accepted the consulting role," he said. She stopped. "You don't need to hear things about my life. You can ask." He nodded slowly. "You're right." The admission surprised them both. "I want you to work," he continued. "I want you to use your skills." "Now you do," she replied softly, after 3 years of silence. "I can't undo that," he said, "but I can stop repeating it." She studied him, searching for manipulation, for calculation. She found uncertainty instead. That night, he didn't disappear behind his office door. He stayed in the living room, reading a book he barely turned the pages of, as if hoping she might join him without being asked. She noticed. She didn't sit. Change, she knew, had to withstand distance before it earned closeness. The following morning, she went into his office to retrieve documents he had asked her to print. The room was immaculate, every surface deliberate, every drawer closed with precision. It was a room built on control. As she reached behind the desk, her fingers brushed against something wedged between the cabinet and the wall. Older. It wasn't labeled, which in Julian's world meant it mattered. Curiosity stirred, quiet but insistent. She pulled it free and opened it. The first page made her breath catch. Legal language, corporate structure, dates. Her name appeared halfway down the page, not written with affection, but embedded in text. Claire Lawson Cross. She flipped the page and then another. Her chest tightened as the words began to connect. Marriage clauses, stability provisions, merger timelines. Her hands trembled as the realization settled in, cold and undeniable. The marriage was not just convenient, it was contractual. Claire sank slowly into the chair, the room suddenly too small to breathe in. The silence that had defined her marriage no longer felt accidental. It felt strategic. The distance, the lack of intimacy, the absence of curiosity. She hadn't been ignored because she was unimportant. She had been ignored because she was already accounted for. The door opened behind her. Julian stepped in, mid-sentence, stopping abruptly when he saw her sitting at his desk, the folder open in front of her. The color drained from his face. "Claire," he said carefully, "let me explain." She looked up at him, calm in a way that frightened even her. "Explain which part?" she asked. "The part where our marriage secured a corporate merger, or the part where my name appears like an asset?" He crossed the room quickly. "It wasn't like that." She stood. "It's exactly like that. It's written. I didn't know all the details when it was drafted," he said. "My father handled most of it." "You signed it," she replied. "You benefited from it." His silence confirmed everything. "So this is why," she said quietly. "Why you kept me at a distance, why touching me never mattered. I wasn't your wife. I was a condition." "That's not true anymore," he said urgently. "But it was true then," she replied. "And you never told me." Julian reached for her arm. She stepped back. "You don't get to touch me now," she said. "Not when I've just learned I was part of a business strategy." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I need time," she continued, "to understand whether anything between us was real or if I've been living inside a deal this entire time." "Claire, please," he said. "Let me fix this." She shook her head. "You don't fix something like this with words." She turned and walked out of the office, leaving behind the man who had just realized that the foundation he built his life on had finally collapsed. And this time, control wouldn't save him. The moment Claire walked out of Julian's office, the silence she left behind was heavier than any argument they had ever avoided. She packed that night without drama. No slammed doors, no accusations, just controlled movements and a trembling resolve that grew steadier with every folded shirt. Julian stood in the doorway, watching, his authority stripped down to helplessness. "I need space," she said without looking at him. "I need to know who I am outside of a contract." "How long?" he asked, voice tight. "I don't know," she replied. "Long enough to think without your shadow." He didn't stop her. That was the first real choice he had made for her. Claire checked into a modest hotel downtown, far from glass towers and curated silence. The room was small, imperfect, and entirely hers. For the first time in 3 years, she slept without wondering if she was intruding on someone else's life. Julian, meanwhile, unraveled. The house felt cavernous without her quiet presence. He walked from room to room, touching objects he had never noticed before. A book she loved, a mug she always used, evidence of a life he had treated as background noise. But regret wasn't enough. He knew that. 3 days later, Julian stood in the Anderson Cross boardroom, a room where men rarely spoke without rehearsed certainty. His father sat at the head of the table, flanked by attorneys and senior executives. The merger documents lay neatly arranged, as they always had. "I want to dissolve the agreement with Lawson Consulting," Julian said. The room froze. "What?" his father snapped. "That merger stabilized 2 quarters of growth." "I don't care," Julian replied evenly. One of the attorneys leaned forward. "You understand the financial implications, penalties, reputation damage." "I understand," Julian said. "Proceed anyway." His father stood abruptly. "This is emotional. You're jeopardizing everything we built." Julian met his gaze. "You built it on deception. I won't." Silence followed, heavy, unforgiving. "Prepare the documents," Julian said to the legal team. "Full reversal. Return control. Let the Lawson family keep every dollar already transferred." The meeting ended in stunned disbelief. Julian left without looking back. His next stop was Claire's parents' home. They welcomed him cautiously, guilt written plainly across their faces. When he explained his decision, her mother cried. Her father stared at the floor, shoulders sagging beneath years of quiet compromise. "She deserved the truth," Julian said. "From all of us." "She did," her father replied hoarsely. Julian didn't stay long. There was only one person whose forgiveness mattered now. Claire spent the week walking the city, letting herself feel anger without burying it. She met Daniel for coffee once, purely as friends. He didn't push. He didn't offer solutions. He simply listened, and that was enough. On the 7th day, her body betrayed her. The nausea came suddenly, violently, leaving her sitting on the bathroom floor with shaking hands and a terrifying thought she hadn't allowed herself to consider. She stared at the calendar on her phone, then at the mirror, then at nothing at all. The pharmacy bag felt heavier than it should have. When the results confirmed what her instincts already knew, Claire sat on the edge of the bed and cried, not with joy, not with fear, but with the overwhelming knowledge that nothing would ever be simple again. She sent Julian a single message: "We need to talk. It's important." His reply came instantly. "Where?" She stared at the words for a long moment. "At home. 1 hour." Returning to the house felt surreal. The walls seemed to wait. Julian was already there when she arrived, exhaustion etched deep into his face. He didn't speak at first. He just watched her as if afraid she might vanish again. "I called off the merger," he said finally. "It's over. Your family has full control, no conditions." She studied him carefully. "Why?" "Because I needed to prove something," he replied. "Not to you, to myself." She took a breath. "I needed to know." Silence stretched between them, fragile but honest. "There's something else," she said quietly. Julian's chest tightened. "What is it?" She reached into her bag and placed the test on the table between them. He stared at it, uncomprehending, until the truth landed. "You're pregnant," he whispered. "Yes." For the first time, Julian Cross dropped to his knees without strategy or pride. He reached for her hands, reverent, terrified, overwhelmed. "This changes everything," he said. Claire met his eyes. "It changes nothing if you're not real." He swallowed hard. "Then let me be real. Let me earn whatever comes next." She didn't answer immediately. But she didn't walk away either. And for Julian, that was the beginning of redemption, not its conclusion. What followed was not forgiveness, but something far more fragile, a long stretch of uncertainty where every step forward could just as easily become a retreat. Claire stayed, not because everything was resolved, and not because the pain had disappeared, but because for the first time Julian had acted without being asked. He had chosen consequence, and that mattered. They lived in the same house again, but not in the same marriage. Boundaries replaced assumptions. Silence was no longer empty, it was intentional. Julian slept in the guest room. He did not touch her unless she reached for him first. He did not make promises. He made space. Every morning he brewed coffee and left it on the counter for her, saying nothing. He attended medical appointments only when she invited him. He listened when she spoke, even when what she said hurt, especially when it hurt. "I'm afraid," Claire admitted one evening, as they sat across from each other, the space between them deliberate. "I'm afraid that once the shock fades, you'll become the man you were again." Julian didn't defend himself. That fear is fair. It was the most honest answer he could have given. Weeks passed like this, slow, uneven, real. Julian stepped back from the company he had once controlled obsessively. He delegated. He declined interviews. When his father questioned him, Julian no longer argued. He simply refused to engage in battles that no longer mattered. Claire noticed the difference not in grand gestures, but in the absence of pressure. He no longer hovered. He no longer tried to win her with intensity. He waited. One afternoon, she found him in the kitchen, struggling with a broken cabinet hinge, frustration written plainly on his face. "Do you want help?" she asked. He looked up, surprised. "Yes," he said. "I think I do." It was a small moment, but it shifted something. They began talking more, cautiously at first, then with increasing ease. About childhood, about mistakes, about the people they had become in response to pain. Julian spoke of growing up in a house where affection was transactional and approval conditional, where love was never modeled, only negotiated. Claire spoke of learning to disappear to survive, of becoming low maintenance because it felt safer than being unwanted. Neither of them interrupted. Neither of them rushed. One night, as rain pressed softly against the windows, Julian finally asked a question he had avoided. "Do you regret marrying me?" Claire considered it carefully. "I regret that I lost myself trying to be convenient, but I don't regret learning who I am." He nodded, absorbing the weight of that truth. The pregnancy changed her body first, then her perspective. She became protective in ways she hadn't expected, not just of the child life, but of her own emotional safety. Julian respected that. He followed her lead, never assuming access, never demanding reassurance. It was Claire who reached for his hand one evening as they sat on the couch, exhaustion settling between them like a shared language. "I don't know what this will look like," she said softly. "Neither do I," Julian replied. "But I'm here, however you need me to be." That night, they didn't cross any boundaries, but the distance between them closed slightly, no longer enforced by fear. A month later, Julian did something unexpected. He sold the house. Not as a declaration, not as a symbolic act, but because Claire had mentioned once quietly that too many memories lived in those walls. Too much silence, too much erasure. He didn't tell her until the paperwork was complete. "I thought we could start somewhere new," he said, "if you want to." Claire stared at him, stunned. "You didn't ask me." "I know," he replied. "I wanted it to be a gift, not a negotiation." They moved into a smaller place in the city, one chosen together. No staff, no wings that swallowed sound, just rooms that required presence. It was there in that ordinary space that something began to grow again. Not passion, not certainty, trust. Late one evening, Julian stood in the doorway of the bedroom, hesitation written across his face. "Claire," he said quietly, "I don't want the marriage we were given. I want the one we choose." She looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the man who had failed her, but the one who had stayed when leaving would have been easier. "Then choose carefully," she said. "I will," he replied, "every day." She reached for his hand, and this time she didn't pull away. The love they were building now was slower, heavier, and far more dangerous than the illusion they had lived before. Because this time, it was real, and real things could be lost. What they were building now did not announce itself loudly, but over time it proved stronger than anything either of them had known before. Claire's pregnancy became visible as the seasons shifted, not just in the gentle curve of her body, but in the way the world began to respond to her differently. Strangers smiled, doors opened, time slowed in unexpected ways. For the first time, she felt undeniably real, not because of who she was married to, but because of who she was becoming. Julian changed alongside her, quietly and without spectacle. He learned how to wait, not the impatient waiting of a man used to control, but the deliberate patience of someone who understood that trust, once broken, did not respond to urgency. He accompanied her when invited, stepped back when asked, and never again confused proximity with entitlement. The night he asked her to marry him again was unplanned. They were sitting on the floor of their new living room, surrounded by unopened boxes, the city humming softly beyond the windows. Claire was sorting through old photographs, remnants of a life she had almost forgotten. Julian watched her for a long time before speaking. "I don't want to keep pretending that the past didn't happen," he said. "But I don't want it to define what comes next either." She looked up, curious but guarded. "Our marriage started as an agreement," he continued. "I want the next one to be a choice. Yours, ours." He didn't kneel. He didn't reach for a ring. He simply waited. Claire felt the weight of that moment settle deep in her chest. She thought about the years she had spent shrinking, about the silence she had mistaken for peace, about the strength it had taken to walk away and the courage it had taken to return. "Yes," she said finally, "but only if we build it differently." Julian nodded. "That's the only way I know how now." The ceremony was small and intentional. No press, no board members, no symbolic gestures meant for anyone outside the moment. Just a garden, soft light, and a handful of people who knew the full story and loved them anyway. Claire wore a simple white dress, her pregnancy unmistakable, embraced rather than hidden. When she walked toward Julian, she did so without hesitation, her step steady, her gaze clear. This time, she was not being given away. She was arriving by choice. Julian's vows were brief but unguarded. He spoke of learning too late what presence meant, of mistaking distance for discipline, of discovering that love was not something that weakened him, but something that had finally taught him how to be human. Claire's voice trembled only once as she spoke. "I waited a long time to be seen," she said. "And when I stopped waiting, you learned how to look. I promise to keep choosing myself, and I promise to choose you as long as you do the same." When they kissed, it was not a beginning. It was a continuation, earned and deliberate. Their son was born on a quiet morning, the city still half asleep. Julian held him with a reverence that surprised even himself, his voice breaking as he whispered promises he didn't yet fully understand but intended to keep. Claire watched them together, her heart full and wary all at once. Love, she had learned, was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to stay despite it. Life did not become perfect after that. There were disagreements, old habits that resurfaced without warning, days when insecurity crept back in and demanded reassurance. But now those moments were met with conversation instead of silence, with accountability instead of retreat. They built something new together, slowly and without shortcuts. A consulting firm that reflected Claire's expertise and Julian's strategic mind, structured deliberately to avoid the power imbalances that had once defined their lives. It grew not because of influence, but because of integrity. Sometimes, late at night, Julian would catch Claire watching him with a thoughtful expression. "What?" he would ask. "I'm just making sure this is still real," she would reply. "It is," he would say, without defensiveness. "And if it ever stops being real, we talk about it." That promise mattered more than anything else. Years later, when their home was filled with laughter instead of echoes, when their son asked questions that demanded honesty, Claire would sometimes think back to the woman she had been at the beginning. The woman who had believed love was something to endure quietly. She no longer recognized her. The marriage that had once been bought and negotiated had become something entirely different. Chosen, earned, alive, and that was the ending she had never known she was allowed to have. This story is not really about wealth, power, or even marriage. At its core, it is about visibility, about what happens when a person lives for years unseen, unheard, and slowly convinces themselves that silence is normal. Claire's journey reminds us that emotional neglect can be just as damaging as open conflict. No shouting, no violence, no obvious cruelty, yet the absence of curiosity, affection, and presence slowly eroded her sense of worth. Many people recognize themselves in that quiet pain, staying in relationships, jobs, or environments where they are tolerated but not truly valued, hoping that patience will eventually be rewarded. Julian's transformation is not a fantasy of instant redemption. It only begins when he faces consequences. Not when he feels jealous, not when he feels afraid of losing control, but when he chooses action over comfort. Giving up power, money, and reputation was not romantic. It was costly. And that is the point. Real change always costs something. If it costs nothing, it usually means nothing. Another powerful lesson lies in Claire's refusal to accept words without proof. She does not rush forgiveness. She does not collapse the moment Julian apologizes. She sets boundaries, demands time, and protects her emotional safety, even while pregnant, even while loving him. This challenges a common narrative that love requires self-sacrifice at any cost. This story argues the opposite. Love that demands you disappear is not love. Love that grows only after you reclaim yourself has a chance to be real. For viewers today, the application is simple but uncomfortable. Ask yourself where in your life you are waiting quietly instead of choosing actively. Are you staying where you are unseen because it feels safer than leaving? Are you offering second chances without requiring real change? Or if you see yourself in Julian, are you mistaking control for care and presence for inconvenience? The story does not promise that people will always change. It shows that change is possible only when accountability replaces entitlement and when love is chosen freely, not secured through leverage or fear. True connection begins when both people are fully present, fully honest, and willing to risk losing power in order to keep dignity. Now we'd love to hear from you. Do you believe people truly change only after facing consequences, or can they change before losing what matters most? Please share your thoughts politely in the comments so others can learn from your perspective. And if stories like this resonate with you, don't forget to subscribe to Untold Journey Stories. Your support helps us continue sharing meaningful stories about love, growth, and second chances.